So as you just heard, we are recording this session. It will be available on the Home Visiting Coordination Initiative website, which I'll drop the link in the chat momentarily, but we are so pleased to be joined this morning by Bonnie Allen. She's the Domestic Violence Program Administrator at New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence, or OPDV. We're so thrilled that you're joining us for this session. A couple reminders, please mute yourself, but feel free to use the chat box to participate. We have a couple opportunities throughout the webinar to really get engaged and use the chat. There will be closed captioning services available. If you go ahead to the bottom of your screen and hover over the CC button, there should be an option to turn on show subtitle. After today's session, I will be sending a follow-up email with a link to the recordings, some follow-up materials, as well as a link to a survey. The Home Visiting Coordination Initiative is a component of the Preschool Development Birth Through 5 grant, and a component of that grant is data collection. So we ask that you please take a look at that survey. Finally, we are offering a part 2 to this session, which is tomorrow from 9 to 10:30. If you need the link to register for that, you can go ahead and send me a private chat or send me an email. I'll put my email in the chat. I'm happy to send you a link to that. So I'm now going to go ahead and turn it over to Bonnie. Again, one quick reminder to mute yourself. And yes, thank you so much for joining us, Bonnie.
Good morning, everyone. I'm happy that we have a nice group of people here today, and we're going to spend the next 90 minutes talking about domestic violence and home visiting. And as Maggie mentioned, there's going to be a part 2 to follow up tomorrow, also at 9 o'clock. So I'm excited to be with you here today to talk about this topic. As Maggie mentioned, my name is Bonnie Allen. I've been with the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence for over 7 years now, and I come to my position here with 25, 30 maybe years of experience working with families and working with systems. The families that are experiencing domestic violence and systems such as law enforcement, healthcare, child welfare systems, our legal system, our court system, and I've done a lot of work training and talking to many different professionals about the intersections of domestic violence and the work that they do. I've worked with victims of domestic violence living in a shelter and also victims that have chosen not to leave their homes and go to shelter. I've worked with children that have been exposed to domestic violence, and I spent a large part of my career working with perpetrators of domestic violence. So I've really seen this problem through a variety of lenses, and I recognize the complexity of it and the difficulties and the challenges in addressing domestic violence. I've done some work as a home visitor in a program. A lot of the work that I've done, even if it wasn't domestic violence specific, involved going into people's homes, and so I know what it's like to be in people's homes and suspect that domestic violence might be happening. And I know how critical it is to be aware of that when you're working in people's homes. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video, but I wanted to at least say good morning and let you see my face before I got started. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. I just want to begin by acknowledging that you all have really difficult jobs. You're working with traumatized individuals every day, and this is challenging for a lot of reasons that we're going to be talking about in the next 90 minutes. When you spend a lot of time hearing others' trauma stories and histories and dealing with the impact of that trauma, it takes a toll on you in many ways. It's so common that people experience the impact of this work that I no longer do presentations without, for people who are working with families, without addressing the impact of the work on the worker. And once we recognize and understand the impact of the work, it's important to take care of yourself to reduce the likelihood of experiencing vicarious trauma. If you're working in a trauma-informed workplace, that's going to help you because the organization, they're going to support your self-care. They're going to recognize that you're doing difficult work, and they're going to encourage you and support you in taking care of yourself. Self-care can be very simple and practiced in the moment on the job or be done after you leave the workplace. It doesn't require a lot of money or time. Sometimes I think people think it's, I need to get away for a week or take a big expensive vacation or spending money on a massage. It can be as simple as stopping in the middle of the day, taking a deep breath, taking a walk, just getting up and stretching. So I would like you to put in the chat box if ways that you practice self-care. What are some ways that that you take care of yourself? Deep breathing, bubble bath, Zumba, these are all excellent. Playing basketball, walking, listening to music, walking, baking, exercise, sleep. Sleep is critical, right? The most basic things, we need to eat well, we need to exercise, we need to sleep. Cleaning it works for a lot of people, right? Meditation, hiking, spending time in nature. And so I'm going to encourage you to keep doing all of that. And if you're not practicing self-care or making the time for that, I'm going to remind you that it's really critical to your health and well-being if you're doing this work to practice self-care, and encourage you every day to commit to at least some portion of your day, even if it's a few minutes, where you take a step away and take care of yourself. I also want to acknowledge when we do domestic violence presentation that most people have at least some personal experience with domestic violence. And because of that experience, they often bring with them very strong thoughts and feelings about it. So as we were just saying, self-care is paramount, and that applies to while you're in this training now. You may hear things that are difficult. You may hear things that you want to step away from for a moment. So I encourage you to do that. If at any point you need to just step away, please do that. I also want you to know that you can reach out to the confidential one-on-one assistance 24 hours a day, 7 days a week through the New York State hotline for victims of both domestic violence and sexual assault. And additionally, the New York State Emotional Support Helpline text is available from 8 to 10, 7 days a week. So I want you to know that you have that information available to you, and that can be a support to you as you're working with clients or if you're struggling with anything related to this topic. We're also going to provide you with resources at the end of the training. And so you'll have all of this information in that resource list. The work that we do is guided by survivors of domestic violence. So it's vitally important that their voices and experiences be a part of this training. I want you to think about all the families you've worked with, where you may have been aware that there was domestic violence or even just suspected that domestic violence was present. Or perhaps you recognized something was off, but you couldn't quite put your finger on what it was. When you're working with families in their homes, you have a very unique opportunity to interact with all family members in their own environment over a significant period of time. You can observe all family members' behaviors and interactions and begin to recognize indicators of domestic violence. You have the advantage of being able to engage with the victim, the survivor, the perpetrator, and the children when making assessments and decisions about a case. So this two-part webinar was going to provide all of you, hopefully, with an increased awareness and understanding of domestic violence. I'm going to be sharing information, tools, and skills to assist home visitors in recognizing domestic violence in the families they are working with and responding appropriately, safely, and effectively. We're going to use a case example to illustrate what domestic violence might look like and what the challenges may be for home visitors. You will gain strategies to safely engage with all family members, and you will have the opportunity to practice using those strategies to build rapport with family members so they can begin to talk about the abuse and its impact in ways that increase victims and child safety and promote offender accountability. We're going to explore domestic violence safety planning and survivor-centered and trauma-informed responses that will help build resiliency and promote healing. So we have a lot on our plate for the next hour and 20 minutes and the following tomorrow when we do part 2. Domestic violence is common. It affects millions of people in the United States each year. Data from the CDC's National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey indicate about 1 in 4 women and nearly 1 in 10 men have experienced contact sexual violence, physical violence, and/or stalking by an intimate partner during their lifetime, and reported some form of IPV-related impact. So that's over 43 million women and 38 million men that have experienced psychological aggression by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And we know that specific communities, including people of color, people in the LGBTQ communities, and communities with fewer resources experience domestic violence at even greater rates. The World Health Organization calls domestic violence a global epidemic, and it costs us personally and collectively in fractured communities, families, people. All of us have a stake in becoming more aware of and responsive to domestic violence. The New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence is the only executive state-level government agency focused on the prevention and awareness of domestic and sexual violence in the United States. So New York is a national leader when it comes to protecting the rights of victims of domestic violence, ending gender-based violence, and preventing sexual violence. And our mission is here up on the screen to improve New York State's response to and prevention of domestic violence with the goal of enhancing the safety of all New Yorkers in their intimate and family relationships. So I mentioned that we're going to be working with a family for this part 1 and part 2. And so I'm going to go ahead and read to you a little bit about this family, and we can come back and I can remind you of it. And I think Maggie's going to put pieces of it in the chat box in case you want to read along or go back to it as we're referring to the family. So we're going to be working with the Pelton family. They've been referred to Home Visiting Services. Sarah Pelton is 27. Chad Pelton is 32. They're married and they have a 10-year-old daughter, Emma. Sarah is 5 months pregnant with Chad's child. And there was a report to the New York Central Registry alleging that Sarah appeared intoxicated when dropping Emma off for school, and that she put Emma and the unborn child at risk by driving under the influence. So that's kind of the quick introduction to the family. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of information about Sarah. Sarah has a prior history of substance use. Her license was revoked due to past DUIs. She was mandated to treatment that she did not complete. She has stopped taking her anxiety and depression medication due to her pregnancy. When Sarah was pregnant with Emma, she continued to drink and did not get prenatal care. Sarah states that she is not drinking and is doing everything her doctor recommends to ensure during this pregnancy to ensure the baby is healthy. Sarah is aware that it is unsafe to drink while pregnant and before driving. Sarah indicates she wants to be sober and tries to go to AA meetings. She has no money for transportation, and Chad refuses to drive her. Although Chad insisted on having another baby, he now seems unhappy with Sarah's pregnancy and that she is tired and worried. She denies being under the influence when driving Emma to school that day. She said she had to drive Emma that morning because she was unable to wake Chad, who usually takes Emma to school. Emma's already missed numerous days of school. Sarah is very connected to her community, knows how to access support and resources. She uses the local food pantry when food is low and has already got donations of a crib and a changing table for the new baby. Sarah engages with the home visitor and appears to appreciate the support and the information related to pregnancy and childbirth that the home visitor provides. Sarah expresses concern for the baby's safety and for being able to provide for the baby with Chad out of work. Sarah trusts that Chad does not like, Sarah trusts the home visitor and has begun to confide in her. Sarah seems open to referrals and support, but expresses that Chad does not like a lot of people in their business. Sarah states that she has lost touch with her sister Kim, who in the past was always tried to help Sarah. She recently reached out to Kim to ask for help getting Emma to her appointments and art classes and Sarah to her prenatal appointments. Kim was happy to hear from Sarah and said she would help however she could, but lives too far away to be a resource for day-to-day activities. So that's a little bit about Sarah. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about Chad. Chad has a history of abusing pain medications. Despite his previous abuse of pain medications, he was recently prescribed pain meds as a result of a back injury caused by a fall when he was working. He's been out of work due to the injury. They were evicted from their apartment. Chad's parents own an apartment building and allowed them to move in with the understanding that it would be temporary. Chad denies abusing his medication. He successfully completed his previous treatment program. He has a close relationship with their daughter, Emma. He states he makes Emma breakfast every day because Sarah won't get out of bed. He also makes sure she gets her homework done. He has explained to Emma that he must help a lot because of her mom's issues and that he wishes Sarah would be a better mom to Emma. So that's Chad. And then we have Emma. Emma is a generally happy child. She is mature for her age. She has a physical disability and uses a wheelchair as a personal assistance device. She has several regular medical appointments that she needs to get to each month, and she sees a therapist every week. She has a best friend, Ashley, who she likes to talk with and do arts and crafts with. She enjoys spending time at Ashley's home. Ashley's mom is great and always makes them treats. Emma has always enjoyed and done well in school. She loves to paint and draw and goes to art classes on Wednesday. She loves both of her parents, but is closest to her dad because of her mom's issues, which her dad has explained to her. So that's the family that we're going to be working with. They have accepted home visiting services. Sarah has kind of indicated to the home visitor that this pregnancy was not really planned and that she has concerns about providing for the baby financially. She mentioned that Chad really wanted to have another baby and refused to use condoms. And Sarah also indicated that her and Chad are having some issues and bringing a baby into the relationship may not be the best situation. Since they've accepted the services, you were informed by Chad's mother, Margaret, that Sarah was treated in the ER for a concussion and needed stitches. Chad's mother confides in you that she doesn't know what happened, but Sarah told her that she and Chad had been fighting. Sarah called Margaret to come and stay with Emma while Chad took her to the hospital. Chad's mom, Margaret, told you that Chad indicated Sarah was drunk and acting crazy. Margaret acknowledges that Sarah has some issues, but states my son has been under a lot of stress lately with the new baby on its way and losing his job. He always has a bad temper and sometimes lets his anger get the best of him. But he loves Sarah and Emma and would never do anything to hurt them. Okay, so that's kind of what you know about the family. As we move on, I'm going to give you a little bit more information about some of the things that Emma reveals and some additional information. But I want to get back to our slides now, but I'm going to come back to give you some additional information. So we're going to talk about the children first. So we know that we have Emma Pelton. She's 10. She's doing well in school and enjoys her classes. She's close with her father, Chad, and she worries about her mom. And then we have the new baby that's, remember, Sarah's 5 months pregnant. So I just want to take a minute and talk about the overlap between domestic violence and child abuse and neglect. Numerous studies document the occurrence of domestic violence and child abuse or maltreatment within the same families. Most studies indicate that in 30 to 60% of families where domestic violence is present, child abuse or maltreatment is also present. And the same is true conversely, right? In 30 to 60% of families where child abuse or maltreatment is present, domestic violence is also present. So what we want to be aware of, if we're in a home where we're aware that there's child abuse, it's likely that there may be domestic violence. If we know that there's domestic violence, it's likely that there may also be child abuse. And so we want to be aware of that. Researchers have estimated that between 3.3 million and 10 million children are exposed to adult domestic violence each year. And we know that that exposure increases the risk to children of physical, emotional, and psychological harm. And research has also shown that some children exposed to domestic violence demonstrate aggression, antisocial behaviors, as well as are more fearful and if so may isolate, may have inhibited behaviors, and are at significantly higher rates than children who are not exposed to domestic violence. So I'm going to ask you to use the chat box again and tell me what are some of the ways that children become aware of domestic violence in their home? What are some of the things that we say? I see in the chat box, yes, Caitlin, they were young when they had their first child. Absolutely. Sorry, I'm just catching up with the chat. And thank you, Maggie, for putting in the information in there.
You're welcome. I'm seeing, shouting, arguing, kids are watching it, seeing it.
Yeah, I see tension, mom is sad and unpresent, isolation, right? So kids, a lot of times we think if they didn't hear it or see it, then, they don't know about it. But what we know is that even if they don't hear it or don't see it, oftentimes they see the aftermath of it. They may see a parent with bruises. They may have seen the police come. They may have to leave their home. They may hear their mom talking to someone about it. And so we know that there's all kinds of ways that children become aware of domestic violence in their home. And we know that a lot of times parents think their children don't know, but research shows us time and time again that if children are growing up in a home with domestic violence, they're aware that it's happening, and they can become aware of that in all of the ways that you all just mentioned. If there's a broken, a hole in the wall, there's all kinds of ways that kids can become aware. Children, particularly girls exposed to domestic violence offenders, are at significantly increased risk of child sexual abuse. Published studies indicate that an abusive person is at least 4 times more likely than a non-abusive abusive person to sexually abuse children in the household, with some studies finding a risk increase by 9 times or more. A recent major publication on family violence recommended that any history of sexual assaults against the mother be treated as a warning sign of possible sexual or physical abuse of the children, right? So that's what we were talking about earlier with child abuse and neglect, and there being an overlap. And the same is true when we're talking about sexual abuse. So I'm going to ask you to use the chat box and answer this question. You can put A, B, C, or D in the chat box. Although many adult children believe that they have protected children from exposure to domestic violence, what percentage of children in those homes can give detailed descriptions of the violence experienced in their families? Okay, I'm seeing lots of C's and D's, and the correct answer is D, 80 to 90%. So as I said earlier, if children are living in homes where there's domestic violence, they are aware of it and they're being impacted by it in some way. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with and have heard of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. I'm going to just take a brief moment to review it quickly. I could spend hours and hours talking about this, but that's not what we're here for today. But I do want to make sure that you're aware that these early adverse childhood experiences impact the health and well-being of children. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood between the years of 0 and 17. And these are what they are here on the screen, right? So any type of abuse, physical, emotional, or sexual, neglect, physical or emotional, or experiencing any household challenges, such as having a parent that is using substances, a parent with a mental health history, or a caretaker with a mental health history experiencing domestic violence, having separation or loss in your family. And we know that as the number of adverse childhood experiences that children have, as those increase, their health and well-being is impacted over the lifetime. And so again, think about the families that you're working with, think about some of the families you've had in the past, and start to think about, what are those children's ACEs scores? And then in addition to those original 10 ACEs, we also know that when children experience, this is called the Beyond ACEs. So we know that when children experience discrimination or poverty or racism or community violence, that those are additional traumatic experiences for children that just add to those original 10 ACEs. And what you'll start to notice, right, is if one of these things is present, then oftentimes many are present. And so it's rare that someone has usually just one ACE, right? A lot of times we see that people have very, very high ACE scores on that original score of 10, and then you add the impact of experiencing these other types of trauma. The single most common factor for children who develop resilience is at least one stable relationship with a supportive parent, caregiver, or other adult. And so this is really, really important. Oftentimes that's the parent who's is the non-offending parent, but it could also be a grandparent, it could be a teacher, it could be a home visitor, right? The capabilities that underlie resilience can be strengthened at any age. The brain and other biological systems are most adaptable early in life. Yet while the development lays the foundation for a wide range of resilient behaviors, it's never too late to build resilience. Age-appropriate health-promoting activities can significantly improve the odds that an individual will recover from stress-inducing experiences. So a lot of times when we talk about the impact on children, it starts to feel very hopeless, and we talk about the adverse childhood experiences. So I really want to stress that children are resilient, and that we can build that resilience. For example, regular physical exercise, stress reduction practices, programs that actively build executive functioning and self-regulation skills can improve the abilities of children and adults to cope with, adapt to, and even prevent adversity in their lives. And we know that adults who strengthen those skills and take care of themselves are then in the position to better model healthy behaviors for their children. And that's a way that we can improve resilience through the next generation. Each child's experience of domestic violence is unique. There's no specific list of behaviors related to exposure that every child will exhibit. Many factors influence our developmental journey through infancy, childhood, and adolescence. Our biology, our relationships with caregiving adults, our experiences, the environment that we live in, and the interaction between all of those. Painful, scary, and overwhelming experiences such as community violence and domestic violence can profoundly impact that developmental journey. And although there are common trauma responses across childhood, understanding the specific needs and experience of children at each developmental stage is going to help you best support them in their ongoing development, and also help them to increase healthy coping skills in the wake of the violence. So again, you can have two children in the same household, right? And you would think that their responses and their reactions might be the same. They could be completely different. So even in the same household with the same parents, their experiences and reactions can be different. When children see, hear, or know about abuse by one parent against the other, they may have many feelings, thoughts, and questions about what's happening and what meaning it has for them. It may not be easy for children to talk about what's happened, but many children who've experienced domestic violence may want to talk about it. They may misunderstand what happened or why it happened. Oftentimes children blame themselves, or oftentimes they blame the parent who's the victim. Sometimes they blame the police or child protective services for feeling like they didn't protect them. Children often feel ashamed about what's happening in the family and may be really afraid of being taken away. Remember that children's understanding of everything that's going on in the dynamics might not be completely accurate, but they are aware and they do have perceptions about what's happening. Sometimes a child may identify the non-offending parent as the person who started the fight because they hit their partner, but not be able to articulate what happened before that. And so don't recognize that maybe that non-offending parent was reacting in self-defense. And so it can be confusing for kids to kind of untease what's actually happening and what the dynamics are. It's important when we're engaging children that we remember that it takes patience and sensitivity. Each child should be approached using developmentally appropriate language and interviewed separately. We want to use simple, clear words and encourage questions and ask for examples. We want to use calm, reassuring tones of voice. We want to pay attention to our body language when we're engaging with kids, and we also want to pay attention to their body language. Sometimes when we're working with kids, particularly younger kids, as many of you may be working with that might be in the home, offering them crowns or Play-Doh, giving them something to kind of do with their hands sometimes decreases their anxiety and helps them to engage more and talk with us. We want to make sure that we're not forcing children to talk about what's happening. We want to allow them to share at their own pace and in ways that are comfortable for them. So this is a activity called the Three Houses. It's a visual tool developed to help children write, draw, and talk about their hopes, dreams, vulnerabilities, worries, and perceptions of what's happening and what's going well in their own voices. So we're going to look today at Ariana's Three Houses. And I'm going to just go through kind of how you can use this tool. So you see in the house, you provide them with the house of good things, right? And you ask them to talk about what are things like in the house of good things. And you can see here that Ariana has lots of people, lots of color, lots of smiley faces. And you can ask the child to draw, and then you can ask them questions about what they're drawing. You know, who's little Stevie? Oh, tell me why everyone's happy. Tell me what's going on in the house. What's that? That looks like a castle in the middle, right? It's really letting the children draw and then asking them questions to get information about how they're feeling and what's happening. Then we asked them about their house of worries. Ariana named it the House of Clowns. And in the House of Clowns, she drew Stephen Sr., who was her mother's boyfriend. And she referred to him as Daddy Stephen and stated that he looks like a freak. She also said his face is stupid. And so when you start to engage the kids as they're drawing, they're going to be talking about what they're drawing, and you can ask them questions about what they're drawing. And then you can ask them their house of dreams, which is asking them to think in the perfect house or in the house of your wishes or what you'd like to see. What would that look like? And so you can see in Ariana's house, everyone's happy. She puts in sisters, and I think she puts in her foster care sisters. But you can start to see how using this tool can get you a lot of information from kids and help make them in a way that feels safe and comfortable for them to start to get their perception of what's happening in the house. So we're going to use the chat box again now. Oh, yes. Thank Katie. There's kinetic family drawing for art therapists too. Yes. The art therapist stuff really, you know, when you get kids drawing, you really, the talking and the pictures, you can get a whole lot of information. I'm going to ask you now, I'm going to pretend to be Emma. And remember, Emma's 10 years old. She's living with her mom and dad, Chad and Sarah. She's a pretty happy kid. Her father has kind of told her that her mom has some issues. She's real close with her dad. And I'm going to ask you to use the chat box to ask me questions and start to help build my trust so that you can maybe start to ask me about what's going on in my home. We're going to only take a couple minutes to do that, but I want to give you an opportunity to practice engaging the child.
I can go ahead and read the chat questions as well, Bonnie. So what do you like to do for fun, Emma?
Hi, I like to do art. I'm really good at art. I go to art class every Wednesday, and my teacher says I'm really good. I do have a pet. I have a pet fish. His name's Harry. I really like my pet fish a lot. What do I love to do? I love to draw, and I really love to go to my friend Ashley's house. Ashley's house is so fun, and her mom's so nice, and it's really great there. I really like when I go that. Yeah, I really like drawing. I'm good at it. I could make you a picture if you wanted. Would you like me to make you a picture? I like to draw like oceans. I like to draw fish, and I like to draw sunsets, and I like to draw like colorful things. I love to put polka dots on things. I like pink a lot. At Ashley's house, I don't know, it's just always like happy at Ashley's. Like her mom is just always home, and her mom like talks to us and plays with us. And I don't know, it's just, I really like it at Ashley's house. Plus, you know what, Ashley's really pink. We do go to the beach sometimes, and sometimes we go on trips together, but now Daddy doesn't have his job anymore, and so I don't think we're going to get to go on a trip. And then the baby's coming, and I know like the babies cost a lot of money, I guess, so I don't think we're going to get to go on a trip this year. Ashley gets to go on vacation every year. I am excited about being big sister. I think I'm going to be really good at it. And Mom said I can help, so that'll be good. And I know, you know, Mom might need help because Dad says sometimes, you know, Mom can't do things right. And sometimes he has to help me because he says Mom can't really help me, or, you know, he says Mom has some problems. So I'm going to help a lot with the baby. My favorite vacation was when we went to the beach. And I remember I got to build a big sandcastle with Daddy. Okay, I'm going to stop this now. But what I want to say is that you guys did amazing, right? It's not, we don't want to jump right into the violence, right? We want to build that relationship. We want to build trust. We want to engage her. We want to get her talking. And then I see like some of you picked up, right? Like what's so great at Ashley's? What's going on with the vacation? And you got a lot of information. You got what she loves to do and what she likes, but you also got that there's something about Ashley's house that feels better to her. You also got that she's aware of the finances of the baby. You got some indication that she has some information about her mom's issues. There's I would be a little concerned, is she feeling like she's going to be responsible to help with this baby in a way that maybe isn't appropriate. So just by talking and asking and getting her engaged and talking, That's when you're going to build the relationship and get her used to speaking to you. And then as you move on, and it takes time, it's not going to happen in the first time you meet the child. I mean, with some kids maybe, but with most not, right? It's going to take a few weeks, but you're building that trusting relationship, and that's going to make it more likely that they engage with you and talk to you about what's happening in their home. So you guys did great. Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit more now about gender-based and domestic violence. Domestic violence, intimate partner violence, sexual assault, trafficking, family violence, all are under the category, under a larger term of violence that we call gender-based violence. Harm or threats to harm committed against a person or persons based on actual or perceived sex, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or other such gender-related characteristics. That's how we define gender-based violence. Think of it as an act of violence that is directly related to or justified by using the gender of the victim or survivors. Gender-based violence can be done by an intimate partner, a family member, a neighbor, an acquaintance, or a stranger. And it can manifest in many different forms, and it's important that we identify what qualifies as gender-based violence. It includes, but is not limited to, domestic violence, sexual violence, human trafficking, reproductive coercion and violence, and gender-based related child abuse. It can happen in public or private, in kitchens, bedrooms, and streets, markets, boardrooms, or in refugee camps. It can include street harassment, groping, whistling, unwanted attention in public spaces. It also can include marital rape and intimate partner violence. It's important to note that gender-based violence does not include actions taken by a person in self-defense against an act or series of acts of gender-based violence. What we're going to be spending our time talking about today is domestic violence. And we define domestic violence as a pattern of behavior used by an individual to establish and maintain power and control over their intimate partner. The behavior includes abusive tactics, threats, and actions that may or may not rise to the level of criminal behavior. And the tactics may include physical, emotional, financial, and sexual abuse. Domestic violence is purposeful behavior. It's about power and control, and the abusive partner's tactics and behaviors are directed at achieving compliance from or control over the victim. Tactics that work to control the victim are selectively chosen by the abuser. Some of the behaviors, like sexual assault, acts of violence, or strangulation, are criminal behavior and can lead to arrest. But many behaviors associated with domestic violence, such as name-calling, put-downs, controlling money, interfering with relationships, undercutting another person's parenting. Think about Chad and Sarah and Emma as I'm reading the definitions. Checking text messages, those are not criminal behavior and they're not arrestable offenses. The other thing that's important to remember is that tactics change. When an abusive partner is using one tactic and that tactic is no longer effective in gaining that control, they will switch different tactics or they'll start to combine tactics. When we're talking today, you'll hear me use victim and survivor. It's important to remember that people experiencing domestic violence may choose to identify as a victim or a survivor or both. And it's okay. You want to, when you're engaging with people, you want to use the language that they use so that they're comfortable. So this is one of my favorite visuals of domestic violence, because when we think of domestic violence and we define domestic violence, it's always about the picture that's on the right, but they're both domestic violence. Abusers effectively weave together intimacy and abuse to control their partner. Abusive relationships are not violent all the time. There are periods when a victim is reminded why they fell in love with their partner. It can be really hard for someone who has never experienced abuse to understand why someone would stay in a relationship that is unhealthy or violent. I will say that no victim of domestic violence ever imagines that they're the type of person who would wind up in such a situation. Whatever we envision when we envision a victim, there is one universal truth to each and every one of those images. None of us ever picture ourselves. And so I think what at times we think of is we need to realize that domestic violence just doesn't happen quickly, right? It's not that you go out on the first date and your date punches you in the face. Not even on the second, third, or fourth date, right? If that happened, most of us would be out of there in 2 seconds. We'd say that it's not. But what happens is they weave that intimacy, and then the abuse starts to happen slowly over time. And it evolves over time. It's a process rather than a single event. And it slowly erodes away a person. And it's a combination of those tactics used over time that are effective in establishing and maintaining power and control. And oftentimes, victims don't even realize what's happening. And then they, at some point, look at their life and think, how did I get here? How is this me? And they may not even recognize that they're experiencing domestic violence. And so remember this image, because you can walk into a family and it can look like the picture on the left, and everybody's going to seem great and happy, and they're going to be looking like they're partnering well together, and everybody's taking care of the kids, and the kids love both mom and dad. But what you're not going to see is probably the picture on the right. And it's possible that the families, it's not only is it possible, it's most likely, right, that in families that are experiencing domestic violence, they can look like either one of these depending on when you catch them. Sometimes all you may see is the tip of the iceberg, the physical abuse, an injury, or a police report. Lack of physical violence, sexual violence, a police report, or an order of protection does not mean that the abuser is any less dangerous to the victim, nor does it mean the victim is any less trapped by the abuse, right? So a lot of times we know victims are asked, well, did you report it to the police? Did you go to the hospital? Did you have injuries? And oftentimes victims haven't done that. I will tell you that some of the most severe cases of domestic violence that I came across were not in domestic violence shelters. They were in other programs, and people had been experiencing abuse and violence and had never told anyone or never gotten any help. So it's important to remember that just because there's not a police report or an order of protection does not mean that there's not domestic violence happening. Oftentimes, incidents of domestic violence are not reported to systems, and there's many, many reasons for that. Oftentimes, victims are afraid to call the police because they are being threatened with more violence. They may have had negative experiences with the police or other systems in the past. We saw from our definition that many behaviors associated with domestic violence, such as name calling, put downs, controlling money, interfering relationships, are not criminal behavior. So people aren't going to call the police for those. Some domestic violence offenders are able to exert complete control over a victim's every action without ever using physical violence or only using threats of physical violence. Survivors talk about emotional abuse being so much worse than physical abuse. And remember, domestic violence looks different to everyone who's experiencing it.
Bonnie, I just wanted to elevate a chat message. Olivia sharing that this is manipulation and the term gaslighting.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely, right? And so some domestic violence offenders are really, really good at purposely and intentionally making the survivor question their own reality. And then what happens is that survivor then starts to question what they believe, what they think, what they feel. And then they even rely on that abusive partner more because they do question themselves, and they question themselves because the abusive partner set that up. So that can be a really, really powerful tactic. When victims start to really question their own reality or their own perceptions, then that person has the ability to be even more controlling and use that abusive behaviors in even stronger ways. Thank you for that. Yeah, manipulation is huge, huge tactic that people use. So I'm going to talk a little bit about staying and leaving. A survivor's reasons for staying with the perpetrator are extremely complex, and in most cases are based on the reality that their abuser will follow through with the threats that they have used to keep them trapped. Oftentimes, the decision to leave an abusive relationship is not as straightforward as it may seem. So I'm going to ask you to take a minute and in the chat box, put in the chat box, what are some of the benefits of staying with an abusive partner? Are there any benefits to staying with an abusive partner? What's financial? Absolutely. Stability, staying with what you know. Family stays together if you have children. Familiarity, no change. The children get to keep their routine. There's the hope that that person's going to change, right? We know that it can be really dangerous to leave. Family, people are afraid of change. It's much easier to keep doing what you're doing than to do something different, even if what you're doing is scary, right? At least that's kind of the known factor. Right, people stay for religious reasons because of their wedding vows. They feel responsible. Remember, abusive partners blame their victims, so victims feel responsible. Money, housing, security, right? Leaving your home and going to a shelter or going to sleep on a couch in your family member's house, that can be really difficult for people to make that choice. And then you have to ask, is that even safe? Are they really going to be safer in that situation? Now, if you could tell, right, they love their partner, right? And people have hope that things are going to get better, believe that love is still there. worried about what other people will think, right? Unfortunately, victims carry a lot of shame and embarrassment with them, and so do children. What are some of the risks to staying? Escalation of abuse, absolutely. Getting beat, death, thank you, injury, mental health concerns, children experiencing adverse childhood death, losing kids, injuries, kids' safety, psychological damage, trauma to children, absolutely. So a lot of risks to staying. Disabilities, 100%. I'm going to ask you, you're going to see, we're going to flip it a little. What are the benefits to leaving? What could be good about leaving? Could be safety, could be freedom, right? Protect their children, long-term safety, independence, right? Getting your identity back. You have a healthy home, you have your mental health, freedom, a sense of independence, and you have the opportunity to break that cycle of violence and your control over your own life. What are some of the risks to leaving? Death. Thank you. That's horrible, but yes, all accurate. Fear of the unknown, escalated violence, losing custody of your kids, loss of finances, losing your family unit, right? They will follow you, right? We have this idea that if you just leave, you'll be safe. And we know that's not always the case. Person will find you and harm you. You may be homeless. Absolutely. That's great. Thank you for these. So what I want to point out, and we do these sometimes in a more visual way, what we start to see, right, is that the risk to staying can be death and injury, and the risk to leaving can be death and injury. And every time we do this activity, we see that so clearly, right? So you told me that death is a risk if someone stays, and that death is a risk if someone leaves. So now we're going to look at that question again, right? The question isn't so much a matter of staying versus leaving, it's a matter of living versus dying. And so what we want to remember is there are risks attached to every single decision a victim of domestic violence makes. There's no easy answers for victims of domestic violence, right? And these are not easy decisions with clear cut, oh, if I leave, all these great things are going to happen. And if I stay, all these bad things are going to happen, right? We just showed that the risks and benefits to leaving and staying can be exactly the same. And so we need to always keep that in mind when we're talking to survivors and thinking about what we think they should do or what we think the solution would be, right? So again, I'm going to ask you to use the chat box. Women are, and then you can do A, B, C, or D, how many times more likely to be killed in the weeks after leaving their abusive partner than at any other time during the relationship? D, 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 D. I see lots and lots of D's, and the correct answer is D. Women are 70 times more likely to be killed in the weeks after leaving their abusive partner than at any other time during the relationship. And while we know that both men and women are killed by their intimate partners, statistics provide a glaring picture of the magnitude and devastating toll that intimate partner violence homicide takes on women. On average, 3 women die at the hands of a current or former intimate partner every day. Victims stay in abusive relationships because they understand something that seems to defy logic. As dangerous as it is in their homes, it is almost far more dangerous to leave. Abusers repeatedly go to extremes to prevent the victim from leaving. One study found in interviews with men who had killed their wives or girlfriends that either threats of separation by their partner or actual separations were most often the precipitating events that led to the murder. And so leaving does not equal safety. And it's really important that we always remember that when we're working with and talking to victims and survivors and families. So domestic violence, and I said this earlier, right, is very complicated. It's multifaceted. There's not a lot of easy answers. In domestic violence, the domestic violence offender's main objective is to dominate and control the victim. In reactive or resistance violence, the victim's main objective is using violence to stop, protect, and or escape from the violence. It may be considered by the victim as a form of self-protection. So I want you to picture for a minute that a perpetrator comes into the kitchen where their partner's cooking dinner. They begin to intimidate and threaten their partner. They back them into a corner and begin strangling them. The victim grabs a knife from the counter and stabs them in the shoulder. When a survivor does use violence and the police are involved, it is often usually the survivor who gets arrested and listed as the suspect, and the perpetrator, who is listed as the victim. So for you, a client who is a survivor of domestic violence could be listed as the perpetrator on a domestic violence incident report, or you may have an order of protection against them. And we say that so that you understand that even when you are in a home where maybe domestic violence has been identified, it's not always clear cut who the perpetrator is and who the victim is. And it's important to remember that, and that even the paperwork may not have it right. Which of the following could intersect with domestic violence? And again, you can use the chat box here. Absolutely. I see all F's, which makes me very happy. All of the above, right? Race, religion, disability, immigration status, all intersect with domestic violence. Intersectionalities are powerful and complex dynamics related to socioeconomic status, oppression, gender, sexual orientation, and ability issues. Intersectionalities, they can include things such as race, ethnicity, religion, disability, immigration, languages spoken. Intersectionalities consider the diversity of status and move us to explore what the effect may be of multiple forms of oppression on the dynamics of domestic violence. So some examples may include the survivors, a survivor fears of race-related police brutality that makes her resistant to calling law enforcement, or a history of cultural alienation by the perpetrator that has increased her isolation from potential supports. Maybe the victim is undocumented and her partner is a citizen. Maybe she doesn't speak English and her partner does. Maybe she's a part of a tight-knit immigrant community, which means it's easy for him to monitor her all the time, right? So we need to always be thinking about how does someone's gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, what role does that play in the violence and the abuse and the ability to access services.
Bonnie, we have a question in the chat. Isn't there protection for victims when they defend themselves?
There is, right? But you have to be able to prove that that's what was happening. Oftentimes you have to prove a history of abuse. And so that's not always easy to do. So yes, there are protections. But again, it comes down to being able to prove who's the primary aggressor, what is the history of abuse, were you, it's not always easy. Thank you for that question. So there's many impacts of domestic violence. Our physical health is impacted when we experience domestic violence. We may have unwanted pregnancies, bruises, high blood pressure, broken bones. 81%, we talked about ACEs earlier, and having the more adverse childhood experience you have and the more health issues you have later in life. 81% of women who said they experienced domestic violence have a chronic health condition. It also impacts our mental health. So in the short term, our mental health impacts, we may have nightmares, we may not be able to sleep, we may experience sleep disorders, eating disorders, we have memory problems, inattention, irritability, we may have long-term cognitive loss, PTSD, depression, anxiety. Oftentimes victims may use substances to cope with the violence or the abuse. And we talked earlier, right, about the 30 to 60% overlap in domestic abuse and child abuse. And we know that exposure to domestic violence may result in antisocial behaviors. Kids may have anxiety, depression, they may be isolated. They may have cognitive impairments, they may engage in risk-taking behaviors. That's part of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. So lots of impacts when families are experiencing domestic violence. Pregnant women were involved in 15% of all domestic violence-related events involving women. A World Health Organization US-based survey also showed that women who had mistimed or unwanted pregnancies reported significantly higher levels of abuse during pregnancy compared with those with intended pregnancies, and that women are 4 times more likely to suffer increased abuse as a result of an unintended or unwanted pregnancy. While this data what the data ignores is that the pregnancy itself can also be a result of the domestic violence in the form of sexual abuse, marital rape, or denial of access to birth control. We mentioned earlier reproductive coercion, and I want you to think about that in the story of Chad and Sarah as well, right? We talked about him wanting that pregnancy and her having some concerns about that pregnancy. In a study analyzing data, 54% of women who commit suicide during pregnancy or in the first year after giving birth were people who had experienced domestic violence. So I want to talk a little bit now about the domestic violence offender. So we're going to remember that Chad Pelton is 29 years old. He is proud of his efforts as a father. He makes lunch and dinner for Emma each day and plays cards and watches TV with her in the evenings. He has told Emma that he's concerned about her mother because she has substance abuse problems. I'm going to just remind you a little bit about Chad. He has a history of abusing pain medications. He did attend and complete his treatment previously, and he's currently out of work. And he has talked to Sarah about the issues the issues as he sees it, about what Sarah's concerns and issues are. So again, if you could use the chat box and put in what are some general biases that a person or people might have about a domestic violence offender? What are some of the first things that come to mind when you think about a domestic violence offender? Who are they? Right? They're a drug addict, right? They're dangerous, they're cruel, they're charismatic, always male. Absolutely. We tend to think male instantly. We think low income, poorly educated, that they're mean, they're manipulated. They may be pillars of the community. We think of them as bad parents, uneducated, right? We have all these ideas about who domestic violence offenders are, right? We think they're narcissistic, selfish, alcoholics, right? Alcohol, substance abuse, that they're bullies, right? And sometimes they are some of those things, traumatized, they may be, right? But just like each victim is different and experiences domestic violence differently, offenders are different too. So we see a lot of the same themes. We see a lot of that abusive, controlling behavior, but it's not always one or the other. And like we said in that picture earlier, a person can be mean and cruel and controlling and abusive, and then you can show up at the house and they can be engaged with the children, taking the kids out. The kids can appear to love them. They appear to be kind and supportive to their partner. And so I think one of the things that's particularly difficult when you're working in people's homes, right, is you're going to oftentimes, and they want you to see, right, the good side of who they are, right? They're going to put on their best show for you because they want you on their side. They want to convince you that they're a good parent, that they're a caring partner and spouse. And so it's important they can be fantastic at projecting a calm, friendly front. Absolutely. And so we need to keep our biases in mind when we're working with domestic violence offenders because they can lead to both false positive and false negative assessments. Oftentimes, we begin forming these biases at a very young age, right? And then those biases are reinforced over and over and over again. So I'm going to ask you, when you go into people's homes, that you don't ever assume, like if you walk into a house and say, oh, there's no domestic violence here, right off the bat, you're making an error. You want to go into every home with the awareness and the recognition that domestic violence could be in this home, right? Because it can look like anything. And anyone can be a perpetrator of domestic violence or a victim of domestic violence. And we really lose the opportunity to assess appropriately and engage appropriately if right off the bat, because of our implicit biases, we say, oh, no domestic violence here, right? And the opposite can be damaging. Maybe we go into a house where we know that mom or dad is a substance user, that they have a criminal history, right? And so we assume that that person is an abusive partner. So we need to really constantly be doing clear, thorough assessments and not making decisions based on our biases. Implicit bias refers to attitudes and stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. These biases, including both positive and negative assessments, are activated involuntarily and without an individual's awareness or intentional control. Biases could give your client the feeling that they are being judged or not believed. So we need to always be aware of and checking our biases. Right. So I'm just catching up with the chat again. It was hidden by the whole family. It was generational. His father was also abusive, right? So these are all of the things that we think that we know about domestic violence offenders. And again, some of them may be right. What we need to remember is that two things that appear to be opposite can both be true. And I think that's what makes this really, really difficult, particularly when you're in the homes and you're seeing people's interactions. Early on in my career, I worked with a family, and I'll never forget this family. The father was so kind and so engaging, and those children loved that thought. And over time, and it took months, um, and actually the father started acknowledging that things weren't perfect in the family, but of course he was blaming the victim. And over time, the victim started to share and engage with the volunteer that was in the home and myself what was happening. But the way that father presented himself, it really kind of pushed up against, we had to work hard to see him as the person that was also then doing those things that the victim was telling us, right? Because it can be really hard to put together that this person who seems friendly, nice, and kind is behaving in these horribly abusive and horrific ways. It can almost be hard to believe. I've done a lot of work with domestic violence offenders, and they'll come into class and they'll talk about their community service and how they coach the soccer team and all these great things that they do. And they take the kids and they help this person and they take their elderly mother to the hospital all the time. And then you read the police report and it can be really, really difficult to wrap your head around. They do all of these things and they also do this. We often hear that domestic violence is because of an anger management issue, that drug use and drinking can exacerbate it. In domestic violence, power and control is present, right? So the abusive partner hits their partner to control them and to coerce them and to instill fear in them, right? They're preventing their partner from using birth control as a way to control them. They're refusing to pay child support so so their victim will not be able to financially survive on their own. It's really important for us to remember that domestic violence is not caused by alcohol or substance use, stress, loss of control, anger, bad temper, poverty, or lack of education. Now, again, that doesn't mean that these things don't exist when there's domestic violence, right? Oftentimes they do intersect and there's all kinds of combinations of these things. But what we want to be really, really careful about is to not say that these things cause the domestic violence. Domestic violence is never the survivor's fault. The abuser's tactics and behaviors are directed at achieving power and control over the victim. Abuse is always a choice. It's critical for you to understand that the perpetrator is the individual responsible for the coercive behaviors and the resulting impact on the children and the survivor and family functioning. And this needs to be addressed directly with the individual, right? We know that domestic violence offenders or perpetrators are masters, right, at blaming other people, denying what's happening, minimizing what's happening. They're really, really good at it. And so we need to keep constantly remembering that the abusive behavior and the actions and what's happening in the family, to the family, are a result of that person's behavior, and they are the only one responsible for for that behavior. Domestic violence is about power and control. An abusive partner's behavior is aimed at first gaining power and control and then maintaining power and control. There's no way of capturing a comprehensive list of tactics used by an abuser. But this model, which has been adapted from the original power and control wheel that was developed by the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project, are the most common tactics. We saw in the definition of domestic violence that it's a pattern of behavior. All right. Oftentimes when we think of a pattern, we think of repetition of the same thing. But when we're talking about domestic violence, the pattern is really the repetition of the tactics. So that abusive person will use the tactic or tactics that are most effective in establishing power and control. And when one tactic is no longer effective, they will change the tactic or combine it with other tactics. So today, an abusive partner may be using physical violence. Tomorrow, it may be using the children or pets or financial abuse. I want to point out that recently Governor Hochul signed into legislation requiring veterinarians to report suspected animal abuse. And the reason I'm pointing that out is because, just like we said, that child abuse and domestic violence often go hand in hand. Animal abuse and domestic violence, unfortunately, often go hand in hand too. And so that's another way that, we might have indicators, right, of domestic violence in the home if we suspect or see animal abuse. So I'm going to ask you to use the chat box again. One of the tactics that abusers use, it's a very powerful tactic, is using children and pets to gain and maintain power and control. So if you could use the chat box and tell me what are some ways that an abusive partner would use the children or pets as a tactic of power and control. Yes, so they'll use child abuse and animal abuse. They'll withhold medical care, absolutely. They threaten to take the children or the pets away, threaten to harm or take the children or the pets away, actually harm the children and the pets, withhold affection, absolutely. Physically harm, giving them pets, right? So you give them pet as a way of, and then you have that as something you can take away from them. Throwing pets out. I've heard stories of people in home visitors or in one particular parole officer. There were two cats and then there were not cats anymore, right? And so those things are happening and you're noticing things. Those are really important things to pay attention to. Right, maybe they'll blame the abused parent as the cause of the problem, right? So we have Chad. Chad's letting Emma know, right? Your mom's not the best mom. I have to do a lot of things. Your mom can't do a lot of things because she uses substances. Neglect them by not feeding them or physically abuse them, getting rid of pets and then blaming the victim for it, right? I've seen that a lot also. So you give something and you take it away. That can be a very powerful tactic. You see pets that aren't cared for or taken care of. Yep, those can be indicators, right? So there's all killing the pet. I can't tell you how many times I have sat in family court. I did custody and visitation mediations in family court. And I can't tell you how many times I sat in family court and listened to stories about abusers that killed the family pet in front of the victim and the children. So it can be a very scary and very powerful tactic.
Bonnie, before we dive into this poll question, we had a question in the chat about the mental health effects or anything you've noticed or expertise you have in terms of the mental health condition or the ability of an abuser or perpetrator to control themselves. Just kind of speaking to what's going on when they get triggered or if they can't control themselves when they get angry.
So what we, it's not an easy question. We do, 90-minute webinars on mental health and the intersections of mental health and domestic violence, right? So it can be very complicated, and oftentimes domestic violence offenders do have mental health histories. But what we find is that, again, that mental health issue is not usually the cause of the abuse, right? It definitely may play a role in exasperating the abuse or escalating the violence. If someone's been on their medication and they stop taking medication, we can see a change in the behavior. But what we want to constantly reinforce is that in many, many situations, we know that abusive partners are in control, right? They can go to work and decide to not be abusive to their colleagues, right? They can go to church, right? And maybe get really angry at something and control themselves. And so what we tend to see is that in most situations, abusive partners can control themselves perfectly well, right? And then when they get home, that's why we kind of think, okay, in this situation, they're making a choice to not control themselves. So the intersections with mental health can make it really complicated and really messy and really difficult to kind of tease out. But what we really see and believe is that it's not the cause of it, right? They may coexist and they may interact with each other, but usually it's not the mental health that's causing the abuse or the violence. Right, and they will, one of the things I just saw someone put in the chat, right? One of the things that we know is that domestic violence offenders will use their mental health issues as an excuse for their behavior, or they'll use the survivors or victims' mental health issues as an excuse for their behavior. And so again, kind of constantly bringing it back when we're working with offenders to their responsibilities, their actions, their choices, right? And helping them to understand that they do have the ability to make choices about how to behave and how to interact with their partner and their kids. So I'm going to talk a little bit about financial abuse. What percentage of domestic violence cases include financial abuse? You can use the chat box.
Seeing lots of D's, couple D's.
Yeah, D's and C's. So the correct answer is D. it's 99%, right? So that's a huge portion of cases, right? Research indicates that financial abuse occurs in 99% of domestic violence cases. Yet 78% of the American public has never heard of financial and abusive relationships. So we have financial abuse happening in virtually every domestic violence case, but many people have never even heard of what that is. So financial abuse is one of the most powerful methods of keeping a victim trapped in an abusive relationship and deeply diminishes the victim's ability to stay safe after leaving. The number one reason victims stay or return to the abusive relationship is because the abusive partner controls their money supply, leaving them with no financial resources to break free. Has anyone watched The Maid on Netflix? If you haven't watched it and you're interested in this lovely topic of domestic violence, I would highly recommend it. It really does a good job. It is so good, but sad. Yes, I see people are watching it. It is right. And they do a lot of times I don't watch domestic violence shows and movies because I get frustrated with how they portray it. But I have to say The Maid did a really good job of the financial piece, of showing how the mom worked hard to protect the child in spite of the abuse that was happening. They did a really good job with the substance use piece. And so I would recommend watching The Maid. It'll give you kind of a real good sense of some of the stuff we're talking about today. Financial abuse seeks to control, sabotage, and/or exploit an intimate partner's financial stability and independence. As with all forms of abuse, financial abuse may begin subtly and progress over time. It may even look like love initially, as the abusers are very effective at weaving together the intimacy and the abuse to control their partner. It can have far-reaching and devastating consequences. It can be a particularly powerful tactic during pregnancy, right? Remember now where Sarah's starting to have some concerns about finances. Even Emma's aware, right? She's hearing something or aware of something that this baby's creating some tension around money. And the early parenting, when the survivor may be out of work for a period of time, have additional medical expenses and infant needs such as diapers, formula, needing a breast pump, needing baby clothes, cribs, car seats. Think of all of the things we need, right? When someone's pregnant, and think about the financial cost of all of that. We saw that Sarah was accessing services and getting donations, so that's good. We also see that Chad's not real thrilled about that. The survivor may be dependent on the domestic violence offender for health insurance for them and their child. The survivor may want to work but not be allowed to work. The domestic violence offender may use the pregnancy and being a mom as a way to keep the survivor home. If the survivor is missing prenatal visits, isn't present for home visits, is worried about finances, has a very limited supply of diapers on hand, all of those can be indicators, right, that the victim is experiencing financial abuse. Can you just put in the chat box any other examples of financial abuse you've seen or indicators of financial abuse in the work that you're doing? Forcing the victim to quit their job. Absolutely. You don't have to work. I want to take care of you. And then they have no control of their money. People having to ask permission, right? Clothes. Maybe there's not money to do laundry or they're not giving them the finances to get to the laundromat. Joint tax returns, right? How are they managing their money? Who's in control? Who's getting that tax return? Stealing money from the survivor, not allowing them to buy things for the children, sabotaging their jobs. So right. So you guys have seen this. The victim doesn't have access to money. They don't have a bank account. They only get an allowance that's not enough to meet the needs, right, of themselves and the children. Those are all excellent examples. Victims of domestic violence are connected to their abusers in countless ways. Emotionally, through the kids they may be raising together, but they're also tied financially. In a recent survey, 3 out of 4 victims said they stayed with their abusive partner longer for economic reasons. Of the 85% of victims who returned to their partners, a significant number cited an inability to address their finances. We know that economic concerns weigh heavily on survivors and most certainly impact their decision-making, even their safety decision-making around whether or not to leave a violent relationship. There are definitely significant costs associated with leaving or attempts to gain some type of freedom or relief from violence of their violent partner. And again, I feel like that show the maid. They actually up in the top corner at different points, they're ticking. Like when she left, she had $300, and then she needed gas, and then she needed to feed her child, and then she needed to try to find a job. But to find a job, she had to buy cleaning supplies, and you just see the money ticking, ticking, ticking down. And it's a very kind of powerful visual of the role that finances plays. We talked a little bit earlier. We know that oftentimes domestic violence offenders or perpetrators use substances and will blame their substance use for their violence. We also know that victims or survivors often use substances to cope with the traumatic effects of the abuse. We also know that sometimes victims are coerced into using substances by an abusive partner who then sabotages their efforts towards recovery and threatens to undermine them with authorities. So you'll see someone force a victim or a survivor to use or get high or drink, and then they'll flip that around and say, see what a bad parent are, you're an addict, you're an alcoholic, no one's going to believe you because we know, everyone knows that you have a drug problem or a mental health problem. So again, we do, trainings on mental health coercion and substance use coercion, which is a very, very powerful tactic that abusive partners will use. So substance abuse coercion, these tactics are used to further control their partner and have a chilling effect on the survivor's ability to access safety and support and to retain custody of their children. No judge will give you custody of these children because of your drug use, or you were in treatment, or you have a therapist, or you had to go to the psych ward, or you had to go to AA. No one's going to believe you. You'll never see those kids again if you call the police or if you try to take my kids from me. Overall, substance use coercion, the implications of substance use coercion may extend to a survivor's ability to access economic support, employment, or social support. This is in addition to the stigma that many people experience regarding substance use, as well as trauma-related feelings that may emerge as a result of being victimized. These tactics are used to further control their partner. And you can see how substance use and mental health coercion can be very, very powerful tactics. So we're going to talk a little bit about engaging and working with domestic violence offenders. Prior to engaging with domestic violence offenders, right, we want to partner with the survivor to determine how to safely and effectively engage with the domestic violence offender, right? The survivor knows the offender better than anyone. They know their reactions, they know their history. So you want to get as much information as possible from the survivor prior to engaging with the domestic violence offender. You want to get information from the survivor. If they're on parole or probation, you want to get that information. You want to know their criminal history, their arrest record, if they have a mental health or substance use history, do they have access to weapons? And again, not everybody's going to have access to all of that information, but the point being, whatever information you can get is going to help you to safely engage with the domestic violence offender. And safety for all really needs to be the priority, right? So your safety as the home visitor and the safety of the victim and the children, and even the safety of the perpetrator, right? The victim and the children are safer when the perpetrator's safer, right? If they're on their medication, if they're going to their treatment, if they're meeting with their probation or parole officer, right? If they're doing all of the things to keep themselves, that's going to increase the likelihood that the victim and the child are safe and that you're safe. If you ever are in a home or in a situation where you feel that's not safe or something just doesn't feel right to you, I always, always, always tell people, trust your gut and have a way to prepare to leave. Oh, I'm really sorry, something came up, I'm going to need to reschedule the visit. Or, oh, my supervisor just called, I'm going to need to leave right now, but I'll be back in touch with you. If a conversation with an offender starts to get a little heated, it's very simple to just say, you know what, I feel like we've done as much work as we can today. We'll continue this conversation another time. Just like we did with Emma, we want to build rapport with the domestic violence offender. We want to show interest. We want to treat them with respect. We want to listen to them. We want to engage them as a parent, right? We can see that Chad is doing a lot of parenting with Emma, right? So we want to talk to him and get him talking about that. And then we want to always be focusing on accountability, right? Helping him to see and understand that his behavior is his choice and he's responsible for it. We want to acknowledge what the domestic violence offender is doing well. right? We want to acknowledge their strengths. We want to set very clear limits with them. Domestic violence offenders can be very manipulative. They can really try to pull us onto their side and get us to collude with them. We want to be really, really careful not to do that. And we want to start to, once we've kind of built that rapport and that relationship, and we kind of know the safest way to engage with them, we also want to educate them about how their behavior impacts the children. And we want to talk to them about what are they willing to do, right, to increase their children's health, safety, and well-being. And we want to keep putting it back on them because they're going to be constantly pulling us to what the victim is doing wrong. And we want to constantly bringing it back to what can they do to increase the health, well-being, and safety of their children. So we can say things, tell me about your relationship with your partner. How'd you meet your partner? What are some of your hopes for your family? What do you enjoy doing with your children? Tell me about your parenting responsibilities. How do disagreements get resolved? What kind of parent do you want to be, right? These are the ways that we can start to engage with and work with the domestic violence offender. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to do that. I just want to check the time. We have a few minutes. So let's take about 3 minutes. I will be Chad, and just like we did with Emma. And so go ahead in the chat box and see if you can get Chad talking a little bit. Things for me growing up were okay. I lived with my mom and my dad and my brother, and we had strong family values. My dad took good care of us, and my mom, she was the best. I do help with Emma a lot. Sarah, she's got some issues, and sometimes she can't get up in the morning, or she's too tired and she worries all the time. Now, of course, she's pregnant, so she's saying that that's a problem. I love being a dad to Emma. Emma's great. I love spending time with her and playing with her, and I don't even really mind, helping her make her lunches. And, I have to do all that because Sarah, like I said, she doesn't always get up in the morning. So I have to do more because of Sarah's issues, but, I like being a good dad. Sarah and I, we take Emma on vacation sometimes. Sometimes we go for walks. The work injury's been hard. I don't like being out of work, and we have the baby. I know Sarah worries all the time, but it'll be fine. My parents are letting us stay here, and, I'll get better soon. She just worries all the time, especially since she's been pregnant. I'll be better soon. Oh, I'm thrilled about having the baby. Like, I love kids, and, this Emma's been so great. And, I think it's going to be great to have another baby. I hope we can have like 3 more babies. I really like having lots of kids in the house. Sarah stopped taking her medication because of the pregnancy. So she's acting a little crazier, and, I don't know. I'm not sure. She might be drinking again. It's hard to know. I think we'll be fine. Sometimes things are a little tough, with me being injured and out of work, and, renting, taking my parents up on their offer. And Sarah, I don't know, she probably would have been happy just to have 1 child, because it's a lot for her to handle. She can't really manage a lot. But I'm hoping, that she's going to get stronger and better, and, she'll be happy to have more kids. I'm sure of it. I help get lunches ready. I clean the house sometimes. My family has, my parents are great. They let us stay here if they're not really charging us. My mom takes Ashley out sometimes. Takes Emma out sometimes. And, my parents really help a lot. And Emma's friends with Ashley, and she goes to Ashley's house, and, she really likes it over there. And Ashley's mom is like a real mom. She really, takes care of the kids and stuff. So Emma likes that. I'm glad she gets to go over there. My role as a parent is, to make sure Emma has what she needs, to make sure that she's well cared for, that she gets to school, that her homework's done. That's what I'm supposed to do. Strong family values, like you work hard, and you take care of your kids, and, you're a good dad, and, moms, they're supposed to, help and be present, and, kids should come first. Okay. I want my kids, when they grow up, I want them to remember that I was a good dad and that I played with them and that I made sure they always had everything that they needed. What do I do to help my wife? Everything, because she doesn't do, I got to do everything to help her. All right, I'm going to stop it only because we're running out of time, because I could play Chad forever. But you guys did a really, really great job, right? You identified what Chad's strengths were. You gave him an opportunity to talk about what he does. You asked him to clarify some of the things that he throw out there to kind of get a sense of what his behaviors are. I love the question, how do you help mom? You got a lot of information, right? And again, you're going to build on that. But what happened is you started to build a relationship with Chad, right? And you gave Chad some credit for the things that he's doing well, which is going to make it more likely that Chad's going to involve you. Now, he's going to constantly be trying to get you on his side and singing Sarah as the problem and building himself up. But as that relationship continues and builds, you're going to have more and more opportunities to question some of that and point out. Like, here's somebody Angel, you said, what do you mean by a real mom when describing Ashley's mom? That's perfect, right? You're clarifying. What does that mean to you? What does that look like? So I know we only have a couple minutes. Is there anything that we've talked about today that you think you can use in working with families? And if so, could you put that in the chat box? I'm seeing more comments for Chad. So I see you've completed your recovery. That's quite an achievement. Excellent, right? Give him credit for the things that he's done well. All right, and if there's put anything in the chat of how you can use something that you learned today, that would be awesome. Oh, the House of Good Things and Worries, excellent. Right, paying attention to your biases, not going off of your preconceived idea of who the victim and perpetrator is, excellent. The 3 houses, awesome. Recognizing financial abuse, being aware of your biases and being aware of the biases other. 2 sides to every story, right? And we want to be careful with that, because we want to make sure we're believing what the victim tells us, right? We don't want to question their side of the story. Their perception of the abuse that they're experiencing is important to keep in mind. Chad's going to tell a different story, right? We want to remember, we want to listen to everyone, right? And we want to take in all the information, and we want to be doing a clear assessment. But we want to be careful about, particularly once we've identified who the victim is really believing what the victim tells us. So yeah, the animal abuse, unfortunately, that those 2 things do go very hand in hand. Reflecting on strategy, welcoming communication, not downplaying the trauma. These are excellent, excellent things. I couldn't think of more things that I would want you to get out.
We have one clarifying question, Bonnie. Is domestic violence, could they both be doing this to each other? So in a case where a family is kind of being toxic to each other?
So when we talk about domestic violence, right, there's different types of intimate partner violence. And so when we're talking about domestic violence, the way we define it, or intimate partner violence, the way we're defining it, we're really talking about that imbalance of power and control. So one person has power and control over the other person, and there really is a primary aggressor and a perpetrator and a victim. There are other types of violence that can happen in homes where people are on equal footing. No one has more power than the other. Maybe violence arises out of some conflict, but then when the power dynamics are the same, and when the conflict is resolved, suppose someone catches someone cheating on them, and then maybe they're physically abusive. There's no history of that. There's no pattern of that. The conflict is resolved. Maybe there was a physical altercation between the parties. We wouldn't be defining that as domestic violence. It's physical abuse in a relationship. But when we're talking about domestic violence, we're really talking about that imbalance of power and control, and really identifying who is the person that's always working on eggshells, that's always afraid and unsafe, and who's the person that has the power. So yeah, you can have couples that are, hitting each other and screaming at each other, but there's not one person that's more afraid or more scared or purposely and intentionally trying to instill fear in that other person. So that can be difficult too, right? Trying to tease out what's what's domestic violence and what's other types of intimate partner violence. So you can connect with us on social media. And then this is my contact information. So if anyone has, you know, they want to send me an email, if there were questions I didn't get to address, you want to pick up the phone and give me a call. I'm always happy to talk to people about this. And I hope that you will all join us again tomorrow. And we're going to talk tomorrow really about engaging with Sarah and how we do that, right? So we've talked about working with Emma and Chad, and tomorrow we're really going to talk about how do we engage with effectively and safely with Sarah, and what's the best way to do that.
Thank you very, very much, Bonnie. This was incredibly informative. I know folks are expressing their gratitude and questions and asking about materials. So I'll be sure in the follow-up email to circulate some resources, some graphics, and a link to this recording, as I said. I do just want to quickly flag again, there will be a link to fill out a survey about today's presentation to provide some feedback. So we ask that you could please fill that out. Again, you can go ahead and send me an email for a link to part 2. Bonnie's contact information is there, and we look forward to seeing folks tomorrow. Thank you again, Bonnie.